Cesar Chavez, an American-born second-generation immigrant who grew up in a segregated America. At the young age of 15, he was forced into the fields of California after his father was injured. At age 19, he joined the Navy, where he served 2 years, and in 1948, he was married. But there were many injustices happening to him and many Mexican immigrant farm workers from the Bracero program. And after the local community service organization refused to unionize for farm workers, he decided to start his own union in 1962 and named the National Farm Workers Association, or NFWA, focusing on unionizing Mexican farm workers. The Bracero program was an agreement with Mexico in which Mexican citizens could be granted temporary job permits and would be allowed to work legally in the U.S. This agreement guaranteed Mexican immigrants free transportation, housing, and essentials while working in the U.S. This was made in response to farm labor shortages during World War II, and over 4.6 million workers were part of the Bracero program from 1942 through 1964. But it exploited its workers. More than enough workers were brought into the country, making them easily replaceable with any sign of a union, resulting in mass deportation. And with a big demand for Bracero jobs and not enough job openings, growers would get away with cutting over half of the wages promised to workers. This inhumane environment kept on being present for the next decades, affecting both Mexican immigrants and other farm workers, with problems that persist till this modern day, mostly regarding the border between Mexico and the U.S. and farm labor issues. Around the same time, in the 1930s to 40s, many Filipino immigrants were moving into the U.S. due to the fact that in that time, the Philippines was in colonial rule of the U.S. Promises of equal rights and good jobs is what attracted them to work in the U.S., but once arrived, they were found with harsh racial laws like outlawing intermarriage and low-paying jobs. Most of these Filipinos, mostly men, remained single, and by the 1960s, most of these men were in their 50s and 60s and still single. And they were known as manos, a respectful term in Ilocano for break brother. And most Filipino workers were made up of these. But in 1965, they had enough of the poor working conditions, now wanting to be treated like respectable workers and given the same rights as local workers. And the 8th of September 1965, in the Delano Grape fields of California, they dropped all their things, walked outside the fields, and started a strike. Most of these Filipino workers that went on strike were part of a union called the Agricultural Workers Organization Committee, or AWOC, run by Larry Ilong. For the first week of this strike, they successfully managed to raise their wages up by 15 cents, or $1.10 an hour, making it the first victory for the farm workers. But soon many Mexican workers started to cross picket lines, which are boundaries set by workers in strike. This was started by growers to raise tensions between Mexican and Filipinos, and it worked, as it was successfully separating both races, which eventually could end the strikes. But Larry Ilong, then leader of AWOC, which was mostly made up of Filipinos, decided to see Cesar Chavez, then leader of NFWA, mostly made up of Mexican immigrants, and tried to convince him to join the strikes. At first, Cesar was reluctant, as he felt his organization was too young, and did not have enough money to participate in a strike. But they both knew that without the help of Mexican workers, it would potentially lead them to rip apart what Filipino workers had accomplished. So, on September 16th, 1965, 156 years after Mexico declared independence from Spain, they set out to walk from Delano to Sacramento, California. This 300-mile march was meant to signify the start of the NFWA's participation in the strike, and to bring awareness to La Causa, or the cause, which was of better wages, living conditions, and overall better treatment. The march itself only started with around 70 workers and volunteers, and eventually, as it passed through many towns, and more people joined the march, which eventually grew, and by the end of the march in Sacramento, they arrived with over 10,000 people. And months later, in April 1966, AWOC and the NFWA merged to form the United Farm Workers, or UFW, Union. And throughout the next 2 years, activists and protesters will go around the country talking about and bringing awareness to the unjust treatment of farm workers in California, and they will ask for one thing to the people.
The only way to win strikes is by then taking our fight to the citizens. to the people in the city especially, and have them help us um, boycott those products that we're striking, and we need that. And that's the only way we've been able to get contracts, and I venture to say that without that, we couldn't possibly organize unions.
By boycotting grapes, it affected their sales and made many grape growers to consider negotiation with the UFW. But throughout the late 60s, the movement was struggling as many people sick of fighting for so long would take on their oppressors with violence, which led to many violent confrontations with growers and protesters. Chavez was always against violence, and inspired by leaders of peaceful protests like Martin Luther King and Gandhi, he kept on going with this tactic. Frustrated with all this fighting, he fasted for over 25 days to send a message about condoning violence and to set himself as an example of a nonviolent protester. On July 29, 1970, the UFW and table grape growers signed a contract where they acknowledged the UFW's demands and raised wages for their farm workers, from $1.65 an hour to $1.80, which might not seem like much, but before the strikes they were being paid $1.10 every hour, and with the raise they will also receive 20 cents for every box their workers picked. They also received a health care plan in which growers will contribute 10 cents an hour that a worker worked for, with an additional 2 cents for every box, which will go to an economic development plan, and agreed to provide better working conditions like careful use of pesticides and better living conditions. Through peaceful debate and diplomacy, the UFW managed to convince table grape growers to raise wages, better working conditions, and persuaded the enactment of laws that now protect immigrant and contracted farm workers. Now, immigrant farm workers have the same rights as local workers, such as equal opportunity, safe working environment, and the right to refuse to work in an unsafe environment. The Delano grape strike is a great example of what two groups of people putting aside their differences and working together for the same goal can accomplish. And because of them, now immigrant farm workers have the same protections as local workers, and it's important to understand their role in society and that it must be compensated fairly, because just like any other workers, they deserve the same rights for their role that is just as important as any other. But even though there is still a lot of injustice and problems to fix, that doesn't discredit the impact the UFW had on immigration culture.
We have a mentality in our nation, has been there for a long time, is that we want quick fixes. Everything should happen quickly and effortlessly. For instance, that there's solutions, if you make a law, pass a law, that ends the problem. But we know it doesn't. We really cannot hope to have quick solutions like we have instant coffee for those problems.